Assalamu alaikum, fellow sciencers. It is I, Aaron Freeman, and not a scientist, but a sciencey optimist. And here I am today with my ace buddy, the Sultan of Sociology, Professor Ahmad Sadri, Professor of Islamic World Studies at Lake Forest College here in beautiful Lake County, just north of Chicago. Good to see you, brother.
Glad to be here.
So the question of the day is, why does the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia create and support so much terrorism? First of all, there's a gigantic assumption in that question, which is that Saudi Arabia does create and support a bunch of terrorism. Is that a fair assumption to make to begin a discussion?
It is. The word terrorism is thrown around by various countries. Every state calls the operators they don't like terrorists. And so it's kind of a term of abuse. But terrorism has a very specific meaning. And in that sense, Saudi Arabia could be said to be the greatest sponsor of terrorism in the exact sense of the word than other countries accused of it, for instance, Iran, could ever hope to be.
Can you, okay, it has an exact meaning in sociological terms?
Yes. So terrorism, basically what it means is attacks on civilians to score political points. And it applies to groups such as Al-Qaeda and its franchises. Most of them are active in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, for instance, or Ahrar al-Sham, or in Africa, Boko Haram, and groups like that.
Well, ISIS, let's not forget the Islamic State.
These are all Al-Qaeda franchises, and their ideology, the kind of Islam that they subscribe to, because this is religious terrorism, the kind of Islam they subscribe to, without exception, is Wahhabi Islam that is propagated only by Saudi Arabia in our world. There's another state that is Wahhabi, Qatar, and the Qataris are have been allies of Saudis in the past, but there are a lot of tensions, and definitely they don't do the kind of propagation of this ideology and the support in both material and military terms of these terrorist organizations in Syria that Saudi Arabia has been engaged in cannot be matched by anybody else. They have also spread this ideology, this kind of death cult ideology of Wahhabism around the Islamic world using their petrodollars, and they have spawned this kind of terrorism in Pakistan that eventually turned into Taliban, that took over Afghanistan, all the way from Indonesia to Tunisia and into Europe and even the United States. They send these missionaries and they send this kind of heralds of their version of Islam that is Wahhabi Islam. Not every Wahhabi is a terrorist, but every terrorist is a Wahhabi.
So now what you were saying is that the kingdom, the KSA, I love referring to them as the KSA. They support a particular Wahhabist kind of Islam. And are you saying that it is because of the Wahhabi version of Islam that Saudi Arabia is in the thrall of the Wahhabi version? That is why we end up seeing so many of the groups with connections to Saudi Arabia, because of the
Wahhabism is a kind of an interpretation of Islam that is a perfect culture for terrorism. It is revivalist, it's puritanical, and it has this fundamentalist pretension of going back to the origin of Islam, which is in the 7th century, the place that is now occupied by Saudi Arabia. The country itself is only 86 years old, only 2 years or 3 years older than the king of the land, Salman. It's a very recent invention. But in that place, we find that it was the origin of Islam. And their pretension is that they want to live like people who lived at that time. And in that time, Arabia was a very tribal place, full of tribal warfare and valorizing of violence, and this kind of either you are with us or you're against us, kind of this Manichaean ideology. And this is a perfect match for all kinds of terroristic activities. And it is no accident that terrorists in the Islamic world, Islamist terrorists, have gravitated to Wahhabism, and they have not gravitated to any other traditional form of Islam, whether Sunni Islam or Shiite Islam.
Now, our buddy Nick Gross points out that the revivalist and puritanical sounds familiar.
Yes, so yeah, those could be very dangerous ideas, because you could have a Christianist, very much like we use the word Islamist. You can weaponize Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism. Any one of them could be weaponized, have been weaponized to become the creed of terrorists. And when you just say, you really want to do away with the traditional interpretations, and this kind of puritanical and revivalist attitude is a perfect match for that kind of desire to weaponize a religion.
But so there are certainly religious fundamentalists all over the joint. Certainly there are religious fundamentalists and even kind of apocalyptic fundamentalism in the United States. But we only see coming from Saudi Arabia, we see a version that is much more evangelically violent. Why Saudi Arabia? Why there? Why? I mean, there are plenty of Wahhabi states around. Why Saudi Arabia?
There is only one other Wahhabi state around, and that's Qatar. Other Muslim countries, none of them are Wahhabi. That version of Islam, Wahhabism, is very much against traditional Islam, and their pretension is that they are the true Muslims and everybody else has deviated from the true path. And so they are very zealot in propagating their ideology. And as you said, when you have this is not a good combination, this kind of the witch's brew. If you want to turn a religion into a perfect culture for terrorism, this kind of puritanical attitude, this kind of revivalist attitude, this kind of attitude that overturns 1,000 years or 1,400 years of tradition in favor of a kind of a new understanding of religion, that is really a dangerous idea. And it has proven to be a perfect match for those who desire to turn Islam into a death cult, into a terroristic ideology.
Okay, but Saudi Arabia is a wealthy state. It is a wealthy state. It is a relatively well-educated. Certainly the men are relatively well-educated. And I guess, as I understand it, a good percentage of the people who are getting online degrees are Saudi women. So, but are you saying that there's nothing unique about Saudi culture in particular, that it's merely that Saudi culture is dominated by this Wahhabi version of Islam? That's the bright line. It's the Wahhabi version of Islam.
Well, the Wahhabi version of Islam is the state cult. It's a state religion in Saudi Arabia. It doesn't follow that all the Saudis are Wahhabis. Indeed, we have Shiites in Saudi Arabia that are greatly...
What?
Yes, there is a great Shiite minority in Saudi Arabia that is greatly under the oppression of the Saudi state, and they are discriminated against. So once, this is kind of like a historical accident that this particular tribe that dominates Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud, became Wahhabi, came under the influence of this reformer Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, and they happen to be the group befriended by Lawrence of Arabia, who basically got them to revolt against the Ottomans in return for sovereignty. And so basically they got to rule the whole country. And another bonus that they got was to call the country after their own tribe. At that time in 1932, when Saudi Arabia became independent, Herbert Hoover was a president in the United States.
Now, are we talking Lawrence of Arabia?
Yes.
Okay. So now, our good buddy Nick just made a really, really interesting point about back to the good old days, because there was a time when if you wanted to be studying you some science, you had to be heading to a Muslim country. That Baghdad was the place for science. And if you could, I could easily imagine a version of nostalgic Islam for the back in the good old days that would say, let us embrace the 800s up to 1100 and embrace the great scientific history of our people. We own the stars. Were named for most of the stars in the sky have Arab names. So why is it that the old timers didn't look back to the 9th century for their inspiration of the good old days?
Well, when Muslim reformers wanted to kind of answer the question, why have we Muslims lagged behind Europe? There was a great deal of nostalgia for the age of Renaissance of Islam, 8th century to 11th, 12th century, as you mentioned. And this is the time when Islamic world is really the font of human civilization, and where Europe is in the depth of its dark ages.
And in fact, that is what point out that to this day, the reason you and I are able to talk is because of an algorithm. Which is an Arabic word. Algebra. This is an Arabic word. The sciences as we know them are overwhelmed by the good old days of Islam.
Yes, I think we should have actually another conversation about that age of Islamic Renaissance that gave us algorithm, algebra, alcohol, and the great strides Muslims made in mathematics. The Greeks were great at geometry, but their Greek math was not great because they didn't have the concept of zero and they didn't have the concept of negative numbers. And so Muslims adopted this from the Indians, and they combined the Greek, the Indian, the Chinese, and the indigenous Islamic science, philosophy, and literature to create this kind of great ferment of Islamic enlightenment.
Okay, so you got this great Islamic enlightenment.
Back to that, Wahhabis are not looking at the Islamic civilization. They consider the Islamic civilization a deviation of the original Islam, the desert Islam of Prophet Muhammad, before 400, 500 years before this Renaissance of Islam. They want to go back to a kind of imaginary, delusional simplicity of Islam that they can never actually access.
Okay, so I guess I guess what I'm trying to go at here is that I think that I assume that there is something unique about Saudi culture, and particularly, let's say that the Wahhabs are a part of Saudi culture that lives even to this day in the center of the country, the Nejd, where they have no access to the sea. And I guess so. What I really want to say is that it's not their fault. As I want to say, well, okay, this is me. What do you want? All right, but it's not their fault because the Wahhabs live in the center of the culture, or in the center of the country, totally, completely, utterly landlocked, and they don't get input from other cultures, so that they are, unlike the Philistines, Palestinians, who were a seafaring culture and saw everybody and met all kinds of other people. And certainly in Iran, and certainly in the south of Iran, where there was a big infusion of lots of different cultures. And I'm just curious, as a sociologist, is that a part of the explanation for the kind of literalist, literary obsession with the Wahhabis in the Nedj?
Well, we should say Wahhabis, not Wahhabis.
Wahhabis. Oh, why?
Yeah. So, this kind of geographical and climatological argument for.
You're making fun of me again. I know you are.
No, I'm not dismissing that. I actually want to agree with you that as part of the explanation, we can't leave out the climate, we can't leave out the economic way of life, and we can't leave out access to the outside world as elements in the great mix of causes that create a particular cultural situation. With the Wahhabis, one can really argue that this desert interpretation of any religion, mostly not basically, I would say the lack of agriculture and dependence on trade and warfare and husbandry, that really does have a great effect on the culture, because when you don't have agriculture, basically you don't have the participation of women. With husbandry, tribal warfare, and trade, men control the economy, and the female influence actually goes down, approaches zero. In areas where you have more agriculture, there is more participation, economic role of the women, and a religion of these areas will not be as harsh and as discriminatory and as patriarchal and as violent. So I would say, yes, climate has something to say about this, and the environment. But let us not forget that the historical accidents are also very important. The fact that this particular tribe was persuaded by Muhammad Abdul Wahhab to follow his way of interpretation of Islam, whereas he was dismissed and kicked out by other tribes whom he tried to convert. This particular tribe accepted this, and they happened to be the tribe that was befriended by the British. And if that had not happened, we would not really have this situation. So yes, the climate and the geography is important, but they are not determining factors.
All right, now this is a really interesting point that Nick brings up. Can you talk a little about the difference between the Shiite, Sunni, and Wahhabi? That's a very interesting distinction, I think. Please expand, sir.
Yeah, so the first Shiite and Sunnis, basically it's a debate over succession of Prophet Muhammad. It's not a really theological debate that you have between Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, or Catholic and Protestant churches. It is not theological. It is historical, and it was a succession debate. Who should succeed Prophet Muhammad? That is where Shiite-Sunni split starts. The Sharia, the interpretation of law, is really not that different between Shiite and Sunnis, and theology is not that different. The main difference really was a political difference, going back to 623, the year Prophet Muhammad died, and the debate over who should succeed him.
Can we tell us a little etymology in here? Shia means follower?
Yes, because they were the followers of Ali, the nephew and son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad, as opposed to Sunni, which is the followers of tradition. They are the people
Sunni means tradition, right?
Traditionalists, yeah.
Okay.
So you basically have traditionalists versus followers, and this is the split that occurs after the Prophet Muhammad. The followers said Ali should be the successor, and the traditionalists argued whatever the community agreed upon, that person should be basically the tribal horse trading that led to the election of Abu Bakr and then Omar and Osman, before Ali got to have his turn as the last caliph. They believe that those four caliphs or khalifas are the rightly guided leaders after Prophet Muhammad, these four leaders. The Shiites believe that the last one, Ali, should have been the first, and the first three are actually the usurpers. But the Wahhabis, basically, Wahhabism is a new form of revivalism that split off of Sunni Islam. One of the four schools within the Sunni Islam called called Hanafi Muslims. I'm sorry, called Hanbali Muslims, and it is a radicalized form of Sunni Islam and that rejects traditionalism, whether the traditionalism of traditionalist Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, but also it anathemizes and declares as heretics all the Shiites.
So I want to say, now I'm sure you're going to tell me where I'm wrong. I don't think I'm totally wrong here, but I think what you're saying is, so the Jews, we believe that the God of Torah, Yahweh, our God of Torah, is the God. The Christians say no. After the reign of Yahweh, there was Jesus, and I think that's kind of what you're saying about the Sunni Shia thing. That the Sunnis who believe they are the traditionalists, they believe they are the Yahwists, like they're like the sort of like the Jews, and the Shia are sort of like the Christians. So they think that after the reign of Yahweh came the reign of Jesus. How wrong is that?
I think that's wrong.
Of course it is.
So, the difference between Shiites and Sunnis is not like between Jews and Christians. The difference is much more subtle. Actually, it is based on who has the right to succeed the Prophet Muhammad. Should it still be charismatic? The way, the house of Jacob becomes is promised by God to be the leaders of Israelites. The Shiites believe the house of Prophet Muhammad, the successors should come from that charismatic line. The Sunnis say no, it is open to Muslim consensus. Whoever Muslims agree upon, that person would be the leader. And there is a lot of arguments between the first three followers of Prophet Muhammad and the last one, that is Ali. The Shiites believe he should have been the first. And so the Shiites and Sunnis have this kind of subtle disagreement on the principle of leadership. Shiites are more charismatic and Sunnis go more with tribal agreement.
So, all right. Is there, well, of course, being Aaron Freeman, the Science, the Optimist, I want to find the bright side of all this. Right? So for example, in theory, the Saudi, you see, not every single Saudi is necessarily a Wahhab and necessarily violent, a supporter of violence. And even the royal family, in theory, are allies of the United States. Nonetheless, there's good evidence that substantial members of the royal family, Prince Bandar Bush, was an active supporter of the 9/11, at least one of the 9/11 hijackers. So how does it work out that the royal family, which depends for its support on the West, the Saudi National Guard is trained by the U.S., all their weapons come from the U.S., how is it that their royal family ends up supporting people who are supporting terrorism, let's just say?
So, the funny thing is that this House of Saud, after the discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia, again, that is another historical accident. Saudis were not always wealthy. They were dirt poor. It was only the discovery of oil that made them so enormously powerful in terms of their financial resources. And with their financial resources, they basically have befriended and partly corrupted the American aristocracy, including our presidential ersatz aristocracies, the House of Bush, the House of Clinton, the House of Obama, and now the House of Trump. They all have been suborned by the Saudi money. These are extremely wealthy people. And it's not only our leaders, the Silicon Valley, when MBS, the famous guy who ordered the murder of Khashoggi.
Wait, just for fun, who is MBS in case someone hasn't been watching?
Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, the son of the King Salman, who ordered, according to CIA's records and everybody else, he ordered the murder of this Khashoggi, this American journalist.
In the Saudi embassy in Turkey, he was strangled and cut up into pieces.
Right. So still, President Trump came out and said, yes, he did it, but we are not going to allow that to interfere with our business interests. So basically, what I'm saying is that this enormous economic resource has allowed Saudis to even corrupt the American business, the American leadership, political leadership, the American journalists, the amount of money they are throwing around in Washington, D.C., the amount of money they are throwing around to buy and establish TV channels. There was a famous scandal when Saudis spending hundreds of millions of dollars buying a state TV station to broadcast their own propaganda against Iran in Persian, in England. This just came out. So they can buy a lot of influence with their money, and they can corrupt a lot of people with their money. So, but on the other hand, you can't separate the Saudis, the Saudi royal family, these princes, from the Wahhabis. Some of them are less religious than others, some are more. Osama bin Laden himself, his entire family are secular and into hedonistic practices, but he happened to kind of find God and become this ascetic prince, millionaire jihadist in Afghanistan. So it is not strange that you would find connections between the perpetrators of 9/11. 15 out of the 19 were Saudi nationals, Saudi citizens, and many of them were supported by various degrees of separation, let's say, from the royal family. But Americans decided, the House of Bush decided to basically brush this under the rug and allow and disallow any revelations of the connections between the Saudis and the events of 9/11.
So on the bright side, say what?
If there is one.
There is a bright side. There's absolutely a bright side. As you know, as we were chatting about earlier, there was just last year the families of the victims of 9/11 were granted permission by U.S. courts to go forward with a lawsuit against certain Saudi nationals for their support, Prince Bandar being one of them, for their support of the 9/11 hijackers, and I assume rooted in the fact that, as you correctly point out, 15 of the 19 were Saudis. So that and even now, and I would further say that it is an optimistic note, that even now, President Berther is roundly excoriated by even some Republicans for his unwillingness to accept the conclusions of the U.S. intelligence. Now tell me, it doesn't give you any. Say what?
Where is the silver lining?
Well, the silver lining is that there's public relations pressure against the Saudi support of terrorism, as in people, even Republicans, criticize. For example, I would posit to you, my dear friend, that you could argue that the murder of Khashoggi was a terrorist act. It was violence intended to have a specific PR effect, as in chilling any possible public criticism of the House of Saud. Is that unfair on my part?
I wouldn't call it terrorism, but I mean it is a regular tyrannical oppression of the journalists, and that the Saudis have been doing for years and years. This just got out of hand because he happened to be an American green card holder and is a writer for Washington Post. Other than that, they have been doing this forever.
But we don't hear about it. It's not a scandal. But this one is a scandal.
This became a scandal. I mean, they waged a war on Yemen, a murderous war full of, wall-to-wall war crimes, created the worst humanitarian disaster in the world, and it didn't have the effect that the murder of Khashoggi had.
What did Stalin say?
About the omelet?
No, about that 25 million. One man's death is a tragedy.
Right.
25 million deaths is a statistic. But again, I call it a silver lining is that one, because it's more public, it's more, this being more public and more roundly criticized, it's easier to fight against because we can see it more clearly. And two, the fact that the U.S. legal system, one of the more robust legal systems around on its good days, one of the more robust systems around, has cleared the way, or to a certain extent cleared the way for victims, American victims of Saudi-supported terror, to hit them in the pocketbook. Now, come on, this is a little bit of a silver lining, no?
I would say it's a very, very, if you really have to be extremely optimistic to consider that to be light at the end of the tunnel.
Okay, I'm a sciencey optimist. Okay, I am the optimist.
Granted, that is, if you wanted to end with a note of optimism, I'm gonna let you.
All right, fair enough. Well, let me just thank my ace buddy, the Sultan of Sociology, Ahmad Sadri. But I think it would be fun to do this, to have a little bit more, a little more depth about this. But I want to thank all the folks for our gang, Nick and Per and Yuval and all the gang for listening. And so we'll see you hopefully next week, and we can chat a little more about whatever is happening, interesting in the news in sociology.
Absolutely, let's do it.
Thank you, my dear brother. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.